President Trump touching down in Beijing for the first visit by a U.S. leader in 9 years. We are counting down to his long-awaited meeting with Xi Jinping in just a few hours from now. This is the Asia Trade. I'm Haidi Stroud-Watts in Beijing, along with Beran in Tokyo. And Shery, of course, we have been counting down to this visit, and we do have the U.S. president on the ground here in Beijing. Air Force One landed just shy of 8 p.m. local time last night, and it is a jam-packed schedule over the next couple of days. We are expecting that welcome ceremony. We do have those talks between the two leaders at the Great Hall of the People expected later on this morning as well. One thing that is new, in addition to some of the possible deliverables that we have been talking about, is this idea of a $30 billion for $30 billion trade barrier reduction framework. This is according to reporting from Reuters, citing unnamed people that are familiar with the administration's objectives, the U.S. administration's objectives, that is. So that's something that we should be watching out for. But certainly when it comes to his schedule, this is what we're looking ahead to over the next couple of days, Shery.
Yeah. A very packed schedule for the next 36 hours of the summit. Of course, we're expecting many different conversations around perhaps trade purchases. And of course, on the backdrop is the war in Iran. Let's get more from our chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, who's outside the Forbidden City in Beijing. Steve, we already saw to how much fanfare the president arrived last night. What are we expecting in terms of deliverables in this summit?
Well, we know it's going to be a lot of pomp and circumstance today. Just down the moat there at the Great Hall of the People at 10 o'clock is going to be the arrival ceremony, and then followed shortly thereafter, 10:15, there's going to be talks between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Probably leading right up to lunch. And then in the afternoon, as you rightfully said, they're going to have a stroll through the grounds of the Temple of Heaven before later this evening having a state dinner. Tomorrow, there's going to be more talks. Obviously, there's going to be a tea ceremony, photo opportunities at the Zhongnanhai Leadership Compound, which is not too far away from here as well. So it's a packed day and a absolutely full itinerary on the number of subjects that they need to talk about, including all those trade deals that are possibly in the offering. But, you just look at the who's who of the CEOs that are coming with Donald Trump who came here. Jen-Hsun Huang, a late addition. Nvidia, that's, sparked a lot of speculation about whether the most advanced accelerators like the H200, which have been approved for sale to China a little while ago by the Trump administration, but the Chinese have been a little bit hesitant to approve their companies from buying that. Again, there's national security concerns on both sides in the United States and China. So that is one area that these two leaders could possibly find some common ground and smooth over some of the concerns that a lot of businesses have here that do businesses here in China, and Chinese companies that do business in the United States, about what are the guardrails, what are the parameters for what falls under national security. We'll talk about that in depth in a little bit. Also, Tim Cook is here, Elon Musk, Kelly Ortberg, the CEO of Boeing, is here. So we're anticipating a long-awaited, a long-negotiated possible airplane order is in the works. Okay, I'm glad you're running this video here as Donald Trump and his entourage came off Air Force One last night at Beijing Airport. It's interesting, and I don't want to read too much into the symbolism, but the Chinese love symbolism and protocol on these arrival ceremonies. But Donald Trump was met by Han Zheng. He's the vice president. But keep in mind, he's no longer on the all-powerful Politburo Standing Committee. He's mostly a ceremonial head. He was the one who went to the coronation of King Charles in the UK. He went to the inauguration of Donald Trump. He is sent off on these kind of diplomatic events. He does not have any real executive power. I'm not saying that this is sending a message, but if you look, the last time Donald Trump was here in 2017, it was Yang Jiechi, a Politburo member, the top diplomat of China. He greeted Donald Trump, a slight elevation above Han Zheng. And if you go back as far as 2009, it was Xi Jinping himself who greeted Barack Obama when he came. Of course, Xi Jinping was vice president then, but he was widely regarded as the heir apparent to Hu Jintao to become the almighty leader of China as he is right now.
Steve, of course, Shery mentioned deliverables, right? And we know that on the Chinese side, they'll be focusing on more substantiating the framework agreement on trade that was reached in Busan last year. What are we hearing in terms of this potential tariff reduction framework that could come to pass?
Yeah, I think this is important because, again, tariffs are one of the T's that the Chinese want to talk about. T's meaning trade and tariffs, technology, obviously Taiwan as well. But on this story that is coming from Reuters, and let me just kind of give you nuts and bolts of it, the U.S. and China are weighing this potential framework whereby each country identifies some $30 billion in goods in which tariffs could be eased without threatening national security interests. And this is key. Last night, I did speak with Manny Menendez. He is the chairman of MCM Group, which is an international advisory body. He's been doing business in China for 47 years. He came here just after diplomatic relations were established in 1979, 3 years after the death of Mao Zedong. He has seen the ups and downs of U.S.-China relations. He says the two most important things with this summit right now is having lasting and sustainable dialogue between the top leaders. So that begins right now. Actually, it began in Busan, really, 6 months ago. But that dialogue also giving clarity to businesses on both sides of the Pacific on what sectors constitute national security. And that's where this $30 billion like-for-like arrangement framework that is being discussed, as reported by Reuters, is part of that equation. Let's hear from Manny Menendez.
With all that's going on in the world today, stability by the number one and number two economy of the world is I can't think of something more paramount. Figuring out how to agree to disagree with respect and finding common ground, I think needs to be worked on continuously, not in just 36 hours, but continuously. I'm really interested in is really having a better definition of national security. What constitutes, especially I'm talking from a business standpoint, where's that line drawn on national security when it comes to products and services? Because once the line is drawn, then the business community can then, I really believe, increase business between both countries.
And both sides, China and the United States, have used national security reasoning for a number of different export controls. Obviously, China has the big hand on the lever of rare earths. And of course, those export controls from the Trump administration have been largely centered on high-tech products like Nvidia, most advanced accelerators. That's why we're going to be watching the movements over the next couple of days of Jen-Hsun Huang and seeing whether there's going to be mutual agreement on the export to China and the purchase by China of the most advanced accelerators like the H200.
Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Angle there, just outside the Forbidden City, very close to where these key conversations will be taking place when the two leaders meet today. For more, let's bring up Bloomberg Insight anchor Linda Arman, who's also here on the ground with us here in Beijing. Really great to see you, and really the sort of palpable excitement over the trip that has been long delayed, that's been pushed back, and just the uncertainty when it comes to the broader backdrop of the war in Iran and some of the trade tensions and geopolitical tensions as well. There is a question as to how Americans, how Chinese, how some of these middle nations are feeling about this relationship.
Well, surprise, surprise, we had Pew Research come up with its numbers saying that more Americans today are more positive about China. And that's quite different from what it was 3 years ago, which was, the all-time low. If you recall, Haidi, at that time it was against a backdrop of COVID, trade tensions, even the spy balloon. And since then, more than double the number of Americans feel positively about China. And you have seen the stabilization in relationships. I mean, Steve pointed to the Busan meeting between Xi Jinping as well as Donald Trump. That really was the start of that stabilization. I mean, they dialed down tariffs, they dialed down the tensions, and I think that's also been reflected in how the Americans view this particular summit. What's also important from this Pew Research is that more Americans view China as a competitor, not a rival. I mean, not as an enemy. And I think that is a key point here, right? I mean, both sides are seen as being competitive when it comes to areas like technology, AI, even trade. But as long as they don't see each other as an enemy, that could bring civilization in the relationship. And bear in mind, U.S.-China relations are the most important relations for the world. I mean, if there is a stable relationship, the world is in a better place. And even leading up to this summit, we heard the messaging from Trump. He was quite complimentary. He talked about how he expects a big fat hug from Xi Jinping when they meet. I mean, that is a different messaging. He talked about how they've worked closely, very well together, and that certainly is better than them fighting.
It's quite interesting because, you know, as sort of unconventional as President Trump's diplomacy can be sometimes, there is a sense that the Chinese are sort of working with it, right? And perhaps his reputation, or his, self-confessed reputation as a deal maker or wanting to be a deal maker, actually plays in a positive way in terms of meeting some of these deliverables. But it's interesting, the shift in the global mindset, because we had that poll, actually quite a few polls and surveys conducted in Australia, where it shows that a lot of those respondents are feeling like China is becoming a more trustworthy partner compared to the US. And this latest poll from the Australian Institute, more than half of Australian voters, 60% of those that responded, 59% I should say, believing that Donald Trump is a greater threat to global security than Vladimir Putin or President Xi Jinping. So it's very interesting how these global shifts in sentiment are playing out.
Yes, strategic alliances are shifting. Venezuela, the Iran war. I mean, the world's watching and wondering, is it going to be in me next? So they're reassessing. If you take a look at what's happening, where I come from in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, I mean, countries are reassessing who, their allies are going to be, who's going to come to the rescue when push comes to shove, when things happen in the South China Sea. Will the U.S. be able to come to their rescue? So, there's definitely a reassessment of what's happening. And also in terms of trade, like Southeast Asia, for instance, is looking inwards. They're looking amongst themselves to see how they can boost trade amongst each other, and that's because of the complications and the disruption in supply chains. And that's the other thing that people are watching, looking out for when it comes to the summit here. I mean, if you take a look at how the Iran war has disrupted the energy supply chain, I mean, it's forced people to reassess their own priorities, their own friends, and I think the Iran war will be a key thing for Xi Jinping. I mean, he holds leverage. I mean, we know China has a strong relationship with Tehran. It is, a strategic partnership between China as well as Iran. So basically, China has a trump card.
Despite, pun intended, whether the president wants to kind of, push that trump card is going to be interesting, right? Because coming into this meeting, he sort of had a bit of an about face, saying that no, Iran won't be dominating in the agenda. He previously said that he wanted to pressure Beijing to help bring Tehran back to the table, and particularly to address some of these things, like obviously the lion's share of oil purchases that feed into Iran's revenue, and as well as the issues of weapons as well. So it'll be quite interesting to see whether that comes up. But, you raise a good point. Obviously, you coming from Singapore, I coming from Australia, there seems to be a new kind of contour of a framework for these middle nations, right? Perhaps to have more influence, perhaps to get together and have a little bit more of a substantial power play here.
Well, that's right. I mean, the ASEAN meeting hosted by the Philippines recently, called for these nations in that region to come together and see how they can counter the pressure from the likes of China as well as the U.S. For a very long time, we were talking about whether or not the countries, the middle powers, will have to choose between, the U.S. or China. And they do not want to choose. They can work with both nations. And despite the rivalry we're seeing, I think they've managed to make it work. But I guess, in the words of the foreign minister of Singapore, the U.S. is seen as having a revisionist policy, a revisionist power, and it has forced countries like Singapore to reassess. So let's see where this goes. But, to your point about the Iran war, I think, no doubt, it will factor quite prominently. Remember that Trump himself has tried to look for an off-ramp to the Iran war, and he hasn't managed to find an off-ramp. He talked about the end of the war, I think about 9 times in the last 5 weeks, and yet here we are with no resolution in sight. So Xi Jinping could play a role in convincing Tehran to de-escalate and perhaps even open up fully the Strait of Hormuz. That is precisely what President Trump wants, and perhaps that would be key in this conversation.
We're following along that very closely. Our Bloomberg Insider anchor Haslinda Aman here in Beijing with me, Shery.
And of course, Haidi, everything around the summit also shifting market sentiment as well. We had an incredible rally and a rebound when it came to the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, but more specifically with Nvidia's Jen-Hsun now joining that summit at the last minute. We're seeing AI chips really being pulled back into focus, and we're seeing some of those names having gained ground in the overnight session. Not to mention that Chinese AI names have also rallied on the expectation that potentially we could see more chip access for China. And all of this, of course, coming at a time when we have seen those record highs for U.S. markets. Another record high for Wall Street in the overnight session. We're talking, of course, about all of those tech names gaining ground. And despite the fact that we continue to see inflation, the pressure from oil prices as well, U.S. PPI accelerating at the fastest rate in 4 years. We will be watching also, of course, Asian assets and how they shape up after we saw Treasury yields continue to gain ground with the 30-year yield topping 5%. Look at the setup across Asia because we will be watching JGBs very closely as well. The 20-year yield was already at the highest level since 1997, and you can see Nikkei futures pointing to some upside. But that AI rally narrative will be very much focused on the Kospi, which rebounded in the previous session. What's interesting, though, is that we continue to see Korean won weakness. So we have seen it really approach that 1,500 level against the U.S. dollar, a lot to do with its oil sensitivity. Take a look at how commodities have been trading, because we are seeing a little bit of those oil prices easing at the moment, but still no real progress when it comes to where the Iran war goes from here. Of course, that peace deal remains pretty elusive 3 months into this conflict, and the structural tightness continues to be felt. We saw the upside when it came to gold prices as well, given of course, or downside to gold prices, a little bit of upside right now. But this, of course, as we continue to factor in the inflation effect of rising energy prices, and all to do with the Iran war. So still to come, we'll be speaking about that conflict with a former U.S. diplomat focused on China, about what to expect from today's Trump-Xi meeting, and of course, how the Iran war also might overshadow some of those conversations. Sarah Beran thinks that the outcome of this summit could be a surprise. This is Bloomberg.
This week, leaders from the world's 2 largest economies will come together in Beijing, with geopolitical stability and the future of global trade on the line. Trust Bloomberg to go beyond the headlines with on-the-ground reporting, expert analysis, and real-time market reaction. The Trump-Xi Summit. Special coverage all week right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Don't look at this visit or China-US relations from who wins, who lose. It's a long-term relationship.
But also trade, in addition to the trade, the investment. China is interested to invest in the U.S. A lot of companies interested to invest. And then if we say those non-sensitive, those really what needed in the U.S., helping the manufacturing, helping the employment in the U.S., why not? So I think President Trump is very pragmatic. He welcomed Chinese investment.
You're watching the Asia Trade live from Beijing, where we're looking ahead to today's meeting between Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Our next guest spent 23 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, including as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy here in Beijing and a Senior Director for China and Taiwan Affairs at the White House National Security Council. Sarah Beran is now a partner at Macro Advisory Partners. We're very grateful for your time today, Sarah, and lots to get through. But let me start off when it comes to your expectations for deliverables, for outcomes of this, because in many ways the lead up and the circumstances of this state visit are highly unusual, right? The ongoing war in the Middle East, this has already been delayed from the previous sort of time frame that we were expecting it to take place. Not to mention President Trump is quite unconventional in his diplomacy efforts. How does that frame the way that you go into this visit?
Certainly, this is an unusual time. There's no two ways about it. But look, I think both sides have actually right-sized their expectations about what can be achieved, both through a leaders' meeting and more broadly in the relationship. A year ago, we were talking about a grand bargain, a strategic reset of the relationship. Now it is about managing a very difficult, conflicted relationship. The president is focused on trade issues. If you look at who's on that plane with him, the CEO delegation coming along to increase U.S. exports, that is really the focus, not the tougher underlying issues like cyber, nuclear buildup, AI, or South China Sea and regional stability. That's not to discount the importance of that leader level meeting. We just need to be realistic about what is possible in this context. There's a bit of a mismatch on time horizon as well. President Trump is looking at short-term gains, tactical wins on exports, and President Xi is looking long-term. How does he position China for a much more contested world where the U.S.-led order is starting to crumble?
It's so very interesting that you mentioned about the right size expectations, because I'm looking at this visit and in a lot of ways you're asking, is this a trade mission or a diplomatic mission, right? When it comes to some of the trickier topics like AI, like accessibility of chips, it was very interesting that we saw that last minute inclusion of Jen-Hsun from Nvidia, right? Does that mean that this is now sort of front and center on the table? And I ask you this because you were the person who was behind putting together that pledge that President Biden made with President Xi about not turning over nuclear capabilities to artificial intelligence.
That's right. And that took us years to negotiate with the Chinese, even though it is a common sense declaration that both sides had implicitly supported in the past. But there is such a high level of distrust, particularly when it comes to AI between the two sides. It's very difficult to reach even the most basic agreement. So look, if the U.S. and China walk away from this meeting with an agreement to talk about the risks inherent in AI, military hallucinations, crisis communications, that would be a win, even if we don't have details on what that would look like. Starting a process would be helpful. But that's going to take hard-nosed diplomacy on the back end to really negotiate the details and set up those channels. And that will take time. On chips, you know, there are folks around the president in his own administration that are calling for continued controls on high-end chips to China. Congress has made its concerns clear, both through legislation and declarations, about the shipping leading-edge chips to China. But you're right, the inclusion of Jen-Hsun Huang in this delegation at the last minute indicates this might still be on the president's mind. And we really won't know until he walks into that room and has those conversations with President Xi, whether we'll see additional flexibility on chip export controls.
When it comes to the tech sector, of course, Beijing has its own leverage with critical minerals. How much of a gap is there between the U.S. trying to catch up to China, and how much has been done so far?
This is a long-term effort to diversify away from reliance on China for rare earths. You know, Tokyo knew of this vulnerability and was in fact hit by rare earth export controls 10, 15 years ago, and it took a concerted effort, and still they were only able to step back from 90% reliance to 60% reliance. The supply chains, the processing, everything is concentrated in China or through Chinese companies. And so, look, we're hearing from the U.S. government now that it is more likely to be 4, 5, 6 years away before we see real diversification. Beijing is not going to give up this tool of leverage, these rare earth export controls, easily. So I expect coming out of this summit, we will see pledges for continued flows of rare earths, approval of licenses, but those controls will in fact remain in place, with China able to ratchet up or down in order to apply leverage to the United States in the future.
And Sarah, of course, another difficult topic will be U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, which President Trump has said will be discussed at the summit. How risky is this topic, given that the U.S. has avoided for decades bringing any consultations up with Beijing beforehand?
I've prepared for 4 leader-level summits between the U.S. and China. At every single summit, Taiwan was, of course, on the agenda. It's about managing risk, ensuring we're communicating clearly about intentions and about concerns. It was never about negotiating arms sales. That was not on the table. You know, the United States has a commitment to Taiwan's self-defense. It supports the status quo. These are all long-standing policies. If arms sales are put on the table as part of negotiations, I would be deeply concerned about the message that sends to regional partners, as well as to Taipei and, frankly, to Beijing. Now, again, I'm not worried about near-term escalation or invasion scenarios. I don't think that's on the table. But looking further out, if there is an indication that the U.S. is starting to step back from that commitment, I do think it will embolden Beijing.
Sarah, what can we expect in terms of concrete action coming from Beijing in terms of its support for Iran?
Beijing has tread very carefully here, weighing its relationships not just with the U.S. and with Tehran, but also with Gulf countries, not taking a position on the mediation other than that the conflict should be brought to a close, the trade routes reopened, and negotiations move forward. I think we're going to see a continuation there. I don't expect a shift in position here. Beijing is wary of being drawn into mediation directly. They see this as a trap, that they will be blamed if things go poorly. Instead, I think it's mostly about behind-the-scenes pressure on Tehran to stay at the table and support for Pakistan in playing that mediator role. That's about the most we can expect at this moment.
Sarah, really great to have you with us. Sarah Beran is a partner at Macro Advisory Partners as we have more ahead, counting down to this meeting between President Xi and Trump. More ahead from Beijing here on the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg.
We're leading China in AI. And I'm going to go see President Xi in 2 weeks. I look forward to that, but I'll say I'm leading. We have very friendly competition, but it'll be a very important trip. We're doing a lot of business with China and making a lot of money. We're making a lot of money. It's different than it used to be. But I'll be talking about that'll be one subject. But he's been very nice about this. You know, in all fairness, he gets like 60% of his oil from Hormuz, and I think he's been very respectful. We haven't been challenged by China. They don't challenge us. We're going to have a meeting with President Xi. It's going to be, I think, quite amazing. He's been a friend of mine. I've gotten along with him very well over the years.
You're watching the Asia Trade. We are live from Beijing, looking ahead to that Trump-Xi meeting in just a few hours' time. Well, President Trump's entourage, including some of the most prominent U.S. business leaders, really reflecting the importance he attaches to commerce with China. Let's bring back our Chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel. And Steve, when in Beijing, when in China, of course, you pick up a copy of the China Daily. And it was very interesting, of course, really wall-to-wall coverage, front-page coverage of the arrival of the U.S. president. And as you say, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance that comes with a visit like this, right? What did you make of what happened after Air Force One hit the ground just under 8 p.m. last night?
You know, Anne-Marie Hordern and I were having discussions all yesterday. So where are the U.S. flags on the highways and on the roads? Because usual state visits have that kind of pomp and ceremony. But I did talk to some people around town. They said, no, they come up right before, on the same day that he arrived. So sure enough, by that afternoon, the highway, the Jichang Gaosu out to the airport, all of a sudden was bedecked with American and Chinese flags. So yes, there is a full state visit type ceremony going to be held throughout the city today, including, of course, at 10 o'clock with the arrival ceremony at the Great Hall of the People, just on the sidelines of Tiananmen Square. You're seeing the footage there of the red carpet treatment with hundreds of youths waving flags, and they were chanting slogans and songs, and they were greeted. He was greeted by Han Zheng, the vice president, largely a ceremonial role, but, you know, the Chinese do put a lot of emphasis on signaling and protocol. And he is not an executive member, if you will, of the top ruling body here, of course, the Communist Party, but he is no longer a member of that all-powerful standing committee, Politburo Standing Committee. So a little bit of a notch down from when Yang Jiechi greeted Donald Trump in 2017. And it was, in fact, Xi Jinping, when he was vice president, that greeted Barack Obama in 2009. But, okay. ceremony, pomp and ceremony aside, we have to get down to business today. And at 10:15 officially is when Xi Jinping and Donald Trump will have the beginning of their first talks after the arrival ceremony at the Great Hall of the People. They're going to have multiple opportunities to have chats, and including Donald Trump has said he wants to have a long talk with Xi Jinping about the war in Iran, even though domestically he sort of wants to downplay the deliverables that might come out of Iran. It's fraught with all kinds of possible problems, no doubt. We don't know how the Chinese leader would react to whatever Donald Trump would ask of the Chinese leadership in wielding their influence on Tehran a little bit more, or whether it might focus on weapons, alleged weapons sales or financial assistance or oil purchases. It's more of, a minefield of problems, including the fact that the public opinion in the United States has deteriorated quite considerably about the war in Iran as it goes into its third month. Okay, so where are the deliverables? It's going to be on the commercial side, hopefully for Donald Trump. That's why he loaded up Air Force One with Jen-Hsun Huang, with Tim Cook, with Elon Musk, and then the other bevy of leaders business leaders who have come with him, including the heads of Cargill. So there's going to be some agricultural purchases announced by the Chinese in soybeans, maybe even beef. We heard about corn. But on the tech front is what we're all really looking at. When Jen-Hsun Huang, as we've been talking about all morning, was added to that itinerary on Air Force One after saying he was not going to necessarily go, that adds a lot of impetus to the dialogue that there could be an agreement on advanced accelerators and what this necessarily means for what has been a bifurcated world in AI. So what will these two leaders be able to agree upon commercially and geopolitically? Because AI is that commercial sector that has blurred the lines between business and geopolitics. Dan Ives of Wedbush Securities, he has, of course, been a longtime bull of not only Tesla, but also he's a commentator, of course, on the AI space. He says the composition of this delegation signals just how much is at stake with this basically 36-hour summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. He says this places the key architect, he's talking about Jen-Hsun Huang, the key architect of the AI hardware stack directly at the center of a high-stakes geopolitical negotiation. That's why the markets are reacting to this. What does all this mean for AI supply chains, AI, the infrastructure? What does it mean for what has been a bifurcated development and China's indigenous innovation in the AI space, which many people I've spoken to here in China say China's advancements in their large language models are advancing and catching up with America's equivalent quite quickly. So there's so much to discuss here. There's going to be a lot of market implications of what deals are done, whether it's Boeing airplanes, soybeans, or even China saying, okay, we're going to let our companies buy the H200 from Nvidia.
Yeah, you've seen that reaction in stocks like Boeing and Nvidia already, right? But Steve, as you sort of alluded to, in a lot of ways, this looks more like a trade mission than a diplomacy mission, but the diplomatic issues are tough. One thing that I'm watching for, does Taiwan need to be worried? Is there a chance that Taiwan can come up as a bargaining chip when they're talking about Iran?
Well, I think that's what a lot of people in Taiwan are quite concerned about. What is Donald Trump willing to say, commit to, or pledge with Xi Jinping, with Taiwan not at the table, no doubt. So it's going to be a tricky balancing act, no doubt, and it's going to have implications on what Dan Ives just talked about, AI supply chains and infrastructure. What does that mean for a company like Nvidia and the entire AI chip supply chain that is largely coming out of Taiwan? So absolutely, I think there's a lot of speculation about, is Donald Trump going to sell Taiwan down the river, or is it a negotiating point for Donald Trump? Is it on the menu, so to speak? But again, does Donald Trump want to kill that golden goose as well? He's a markets guy. He's a transactional guy. So, we can speculate all we want, but we need to hear what these two leaders say about Taiwan. Clearly, though, Xi Jinping wants to get assurances from Donald Trump about whether it's the arms sales package that is pending right now in Washington, D.C., whether that's going to go through or not. That for many, many years, and I've been covering China for 36 years, arms sales to Taiwan is a real sticking point. It leads to war games in the Taiwan Strait. It has been a real big problem, not necessarily on commercial relations, but on geopolitical relations. Now, I want to bring up another point, because in the last hour I talked about my interview last night with Manny Menendez. He's been doing business here since 1979. He was the first. He arranged the first major joint venture between China and the United States after the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1979. He knows how to do a joint venture in China between American and Chinese companies. He suggests one springboard from this summit, and as relations potentially improve, is to allow Chinese companies to go to America and set up similar type JVs. Here's what he had to say on that point.
China by far is ahead on EVs, everyone knows that, and new energy. So I think that there's big opportunities to partner, just like when we came to China in the early days, lots of joint ventures, lots of companies and countries coming into the market, joint venturing with local partners. I'd like to see that happen now with China being allowed to invest in the U.S.
And again, that's why he puts the importance on this so-called framework of a Board of Trade and Board of Investments, where businesses both in China and the United States can have sort of guardrails or guidelines, if you will, on what businesses that they want to invest in are going to trigger those national security reviews and constraints. And that's something that could be announced in this two-day summit.
Steve, you know, you've been covering China for so long. This has been your beat for a number of years now. I do wonder, do you think the Trump presidency fundamentally changes the relationship, the strategic competition between the US and China? Because there is this also a sense that the two sides are coming into this meeting with potentially lower expectations, right? Perhaps what President Trump really wants is a manageable, stable relationship while he deals with the two other global conflicts and midterms coming up at home and, you know, the US economy and the things that perhaps are more of a priority right now.
Well, it's difficult to say whether Donald Trump himself and that administration has fundamentally changed the trajectory of U.S.-China relations. But what I can clearly say is he's taken a different approach than previous administrations, and the circumstances on why he took those choices, made those choices, have changed. China is much larger, much more advanced, much more influential, has levers of sway, in particular in rare earths. China is not just a rising power, it is a power that wants to be treated on equal footing as the United States, where the narrative from here says the United States is a declining power. I'm not saying that, but the dynamics have definitely changed. The optics have changed, and you have a leader who is here in China trying to project that strength. Donald Trump is maybe, his policies are maybe a symptom of America's dissatisfaction with the status quo. So, you know, I don't want to get political here or even indicate my leanings politically, which I never do on television, but it might be a representation of the change of the dynamic and the change of the two nations' economies and their rise to preeminence and their pursuit of preeminence as the world leaders.
Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Angle there, just outside the Forbidden City, and of course we're just about 2 hours away from that welcome ceremony for President Trump. Subscribers can also get more on the terminal for the Trump Xi Summit. TL If You Go is your function for the latest updates, commentary, analysis from our team of expert editors. We do have much more ahead as we continue to track this visit here in Beijing. The Asia Trade continues next. This is Bloomberg.
A rally in technology giants has driven U.S. stocks to all-time highs as traders digest data showing a resurgence in U.S. inflation that's fueling bets the Fed will keep rates higher for longer. Let's bring in Bloomberg MLive strategist Mark Cranfield and our Asia equities reporter Winnie Su. Mark, let me start with you because we do have pressure from inflation, higher oil prices, of course, not to mention higher yields. But stocks continue to rally. How narrow is this multi-year high?
I think the issue from an investor's in the equities point of view is that they can handle slightly higher yields in the United States as long as oil markets are relatively stable. Oil prices can be high, but as long as they're not spiking up towards 150, somewhere in that kind of range. If they're staying around 100, that's sort of predictable from an equity point of view. And you've got this forward-looking aspect of the equity market, which obviously is very impressed by what the AI story has to say. And overnight, you've had some major companies, I'm sure Winnie's going to talk more about it, but you've had some major companies who are projecting amazing future for the whole AI story. If you look at, for example, SoftBank, ADRs rose 6% overnight. They had seemingly very strong numbers in the quarter. But the biggest aspect of that was the revaluation of their holding in OpenAI. They revised it up substantially, which means that OpenAI really needs to hit that $1 trillion IPO threshold. Otherwise, SoftBank will unravel pretty fast. So much of what we see going on in the equity market story, the AI narrative, is driven by where people see valuations in the future, particularly related to OpenAI, Anthropic, and to some extent SpaceX as well. So as long as we keep on projecting towards those, as long as those numbers remain very big, people will be happy. For now, everyone's inclined to believe that. We're also hoping that from the Trump-Xi meeting, there'll be some positive fallout from that point of view. That's why Nvidia boss is along with the story. So there's an awful lot being priced on a continuation of this amazing narrative going on and on as far as the AI story is concerned. It could unravel at any moment, but for now, people don't want to stop. The party is going on. They do not want the music to stop.
When it comes to projecting into the future, the bond space, though, projecting more inflation, no wonder we're seeing Treasury yields now, especially at the long end with the 30-year topping 5%. And we had a 30-year auction also with a 5% handle, right? What are the implications of this for the broader markets, especially as we try to price what the Fed will do under the new chair, Kevin Warsh?
Not just for the Federal Reserve. Today, we have a Japanese 30-year auction as well. I mean, that auction is going to be an awful lot more difficult. Overnight, as you say, 5% yield on the 30-year. And you can tell that investors weren't that impressed because typically, if the yield is so good, the market will rebound immediately afterwards. That was not the case with the 30-year Treasury when it hit 5%. It stayed up there. So today's 30-year auction in JGBs is going to be pretty tough. And that really is a global story. So you've got Treasuries, JGBs, UK bonds, which are also heading towards 6% at the long end of the curve as well. It's a reinforcing picture. The job for the Federal Reserve Chairman when he comes in, Kevin Warsh, is extremely difficult. It's not just that inflation numbers are high, it's that core numbers are very sticky. Cyclical inflation is rising as well. All of those things are starting to tell people that the Federal Reserve should start to raise interest rates, not lower them as President Trump would like to do. So investors really here are taking a step back and saying, well, the central banks everywhere need to be a lot more dogmatic on what these inflation numbers mean. If they don't hear those kind of reassuring signals, the market will take it into its own hands. The bond vigilantes are just warming up. This could get a lot worse if they don't hear reassuring messages from people like Kevin Warsh and other central bank leaders.
Bloomberg MLive strategist Mark Cranfield there. Well, another risk event. Today's meeting between President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping could be the next test for stocks that are clocking one record after another. Let me bring Winnie back into the conversation. So chips will be a big focus now that we know that Jen-Hsun of Nvidia had that last-minute invite to join these meetings. Is this more of an upside or a downside risk for the sector that's been rallying so hard?
Yeah, for now, it seems to be providing another tailwind, as we can see that yesterday, in fact, it has pushed these Chinese AI names like Minimax, Zhipu to a double-digit jump. And that is all on that optimism that this can potentially mean a deal around the U.S. Chip export, and potentially that China can be getting more access and even higher, more advanced chips for its chip industry. So that seems to be quite of a boost for now. But yeah, overall, it is quite a pleasant surprise that we had yesterday.
We've already seen some of the reaction when it comes to the companies that are expected to do well out of this, right? Representatives obviously going into the meetings in Beijing from Boeing, from Tesla, Apple, and the such as well, and Nvidia also seeing those gains overnight. What are the investor expectations, I guess, of some of the winners and losers here?
Yeah, so actually, before we had that surprise of Nvidia's and Jen-Hsun joining, the overall expectation, I would say, in markets remain quite low. It's a bit of a cautious optimism because so much has already been priced in. And in fact, both Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan said that they are just seeing a moderate upside based on what they saw historically, what happened after the meeting between President Trump and Xi. However, as you mentioned, there are going to be key sectors that we will be watching, especially with discussions going on when it comes to China's potential deal of Boeing aircrafts, and also some more conversations when it comes to rare earth agricultural products as well.
Bloomberg Asia Equities reporter Winnie Su there. You can also, of course, explore live streaming news and interviews, as well as all Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more in one place. All of that is at bloomberg.com/videos. We are counting down to the welcome ceremony for US President Donald Trump on the first presidential visit to China in 9 years. That's coming up in about 2 hours' time. Live here in Beijing, this is the Asia Trade.
Here are the latest from the corporate front. SoftBank's profit jumped in the March quarter, driven almost entirely by gains in its OpenAI stake. Net income totaled $11.6 billion, helped by a $25 billion surge in its OpenAI holdings. SoftBank's founder, Masayoshi Son, has committed to lift total investment in the AI startup to almost $65 billion by year-end. Ford shares surged to a 6-year high after Morgan Stanley issued a bullish call, citing potential deals between its energy storage business and hyperscalers. The bank estimates Ford Energy could be worth $10 billion and sees opportunity for its valuation to approach that of Tesla's energy business. Ford signed a licensing deal in 2023 with Chinese battery giant CATL. We'll be watching some of those Chinese AI names at the open later this morning, as we, of course, were headed towards the President Trump and Xi Jinping meeting. And this is the setup after we saw 10 days of gains for the offshore yuan against the U.S. dollar. A little bit of downside pressure for the ASX 200, but of course, you're seeing Nikkei futures pointing to some upside. The TOPIX is already near a record high, so we'll be watching if we see any gains in this session. But in Japan, it'll be the 30-year JGB auction that will be in focus. It could be a tough one because we had the 30-year Treasury auction that saw the first 5% handle since 2007, all to do with energy prices, inflation accelerating. And of course, that is key in the downside when we've seen in the Korean won as well. Although, Haidi, we are seeing some upside for futures. Of course, we've had a tech rally overnight.
And that is adding to put it through when it comes to China tech stocks as well, right? Of course, that rise that we saw in Nvidia overnight, the sort of optimism that perhaps AI and chips is back on the table for this Trump-Xi summit is very much driving that sentiment. But keep it here on Bloomberg, our coverage of this highly anticipated meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping here in Beijing, with the market opens in Sydney, Seoul and Tokyo next. And we also have, of course, counting down to that welcome ceremony for President Trump here in Beijing, followed by the talks between the two leaders. It is a jam-packed agenda over this 36-hour visit, which is the first by a US president in almost a decade. This is Bloomberg. This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. And of course, it is all eyes here on Beijing, where we are covering the Trump Xi Leadership Summit. We're counting down in just a couple of hours. We'll have that welcome ceremony. So much a part of this trip, of course, is the pomp and ceremony and the formalities which began as we saw Air Force One with the president and his delegation touching down just before 8 p.m. local time here in Beijing last night. You can see those images of children there greeting the U.S. president. It's first worth mentioning that the First Lady has opted not to be on this trip with him, but we also did see the Vice President there to greet him, along with, of course, what we know is really the heavyweights of Team Corporate America on this delegation with him. And that does suggest, Shery, that a big focus of this is not just, of course, the geopolitics, Iran, Taiwan, some of those thornier, longer-term issues, but also it is a trade mission.
It's a trade mission. Will we see some gestures around agriculture tariffs? Will we also see perhaps some more insight into those semiconductor exports into China, given that we saw CEO of Nvidia, Jen-Hsun, join the delegation at the last minute? So tech is at the center right now when we're looking at Asian markets today. The Nikkei gaining 0.2% right at the open, but we had already seen the topics trade around record highs, so we're seeing a little bit of downside pressure as we're watching the Japanese yen holding steady at the moment. What will be key today is also the JGB space, given that we saw a 30-year auction for treasuries, quite a tough one with a 5% handle for the first time since 2007. So a 30-year JGB auction that's happening today could also be a bit challenging. Take a look at how South Korea is opening, given, of course, that we have seen that rebound led by AI, tech, the expectations of perhaps more chip access for China. We will be watching the likes of Samsung, SK Hynix, Samsung already in the $1 trillion club. SK Hynix getting very close to that as well. The Kospi gaining 0.7% at the open. What's interesting, though, is that the Korean won still pretty weak, very close to that 1,500 level. And of course, it's that oil sensitivity that we're seeing in markets like South Korea, markets like Japan, where they're very heavily dependent on oil from the Middle East as the Iran war continues. Take a look at oil prices. We're seeing a little bit of easing early in the Asia session, but of course the physical, the structural tightness is there for the market. So we continue to follow prices at around that $100 a barrel level. We'll also be watching, of course, as I mentioned, yields, because yields have risen, Haidi, especially given the inflation boost that we got in the U.S. Both CPI, PPI this week really beating economists' expectations and accelerating, of course, all to do with the Iran war and the oil shock.
And that is, Shery, something that President Trump has indicated he wants President Xi Jinping and China's help with, right? Being, of course, a major trading partner of Iran, the major contributor to revenue through the lion's share of oil purchases, as well as some of the conversations around weapons as well. That's going to be a difficult conversation point, and that's going to also bring in potentially these fears around Taiwan. There's been a lot of concerns that potentially U.S. policy to Taiwan could change as a result of some sort of bargaining chip situation for Beijing's help with Iran. But take a look at the schedule in terms of what we're expecting over the next 36 hours or so. We do, of course, as I mentioned, have the welcoming ceremony. There'll be those key talks between the two leaders. There'll be a tour of the Temple of Heaven, followed by that welcome official state banquet this evening. That's always, a highlight when it comes to some of the ceremony and the formality of these sorts of state visits. When it gets to Friday, of course, Trump is leaving on Friday, but we do have before then tea as well as a working lunch before that departure. So, Shery, a lot on the agenda and a lot of implication for markets as well, right? And I'm watching in particular whether we could see that further leg up in China's tech sector and those stocks that have been at or near record highs when it comes to the Star 50 or the TANX, but of course, still very much trailing the rally that we've seen in the likes of Korea and Taiwan this year.
Yeah, in the overnight session, though, we did see that summit optimism translate to that AI names coming from China rallying. And of course, in the lead up, we've seen the offshore yuan also gain ground for the last 10 sessions, which will be the longest since 2017. Let's bring in Homi Lee, senior macro strategist at Lombard Odier, to discuss what's happening across global markets. Homi, what will you be watching closely this week as we head towards the Trump-Xi summit in just a few hours?
Well, the result of the summit will definitely be a key factor to watch. It's very difficult to predict the actual outcome. We are, as a base case, assuming relatively low impact, the summit result that still keeps the truce between the two countries, and that's good enough from our perspective. The fact that the world's most powerful two countries are talking to each other and trying to keep their relations, on a relatively stable footing, that's positive enough. Especially, we are dealing with the geopolitical complication elsewhere in the world. So we'll have to see what kind of compromise and deliverables that these two leaders come up with regards to the, first of all, sanctions activities leading to this summit related to Iran, but also export controls, product purchases, and potentially some new gestures on the AI safety. So if there's any kind of a breakthrough, including potentially the sales of semiconductors to China, then that will certainly provide some boost to the market sentiment. But we'll have to see. But even a low-impact summit that keeps peace is still good enough for the market from our perspective.
More of a boost to market sentiment already. We have tech names at record highs. U.S. stocks continue to rally and all centered around the AI rally. So how much more room do we have here?
Well, if you look at both market data and the economic data for the AI-related capex, we're not only getting very, very robust numbers, and we're already confirming that in the first quarter earnings results, not just from the U.S., but also from major hardware manufacturers and the industrials around the world. So we are now beginning to see a bit of positive spillover from this capex to the broader global economy, and that trend will likely continue. We're talking about investment that's seen as strategic, not just by businesses, but also governments around the world. And as a result, this trend that we're seeing, for data center capex and the related hardware boom will likely continue. And adding to this, is the potential global dash to electrification and defense spending after the conflict is over, in due time for the Strait of Hormuz. And if that's the case, then certainly these cheap names, especially in Asia, who provide a lot of capital goods for the capex theme, could get another boost as we go forward. So we think the capex boom is here, and it's here to stay. And there could potentially be even more capex boom, if there is a confirmation of some sort of a de facto reopening of the Hormuz Strait. And that means that we're still in the middle of this late cycle rally for the markets, and that's supportive for the markets in our view, and so that's certainly a key theme as we go forward.
Are higher yields going to be an issue? We know that a lot of the capex from hyperscalers have been based on debt as well. If we continue to see the oil shock fuel inflation globally.
So the inflation risk is definitely one of the risks that we need to watch in thinking about the longevity of this market rally. And certainly it's something that we cannot ignore. Now, the volatility in the long end of the yield curve around the world, it's partly a correlation due to what's happening in the UK, worries about the political instability there potentially, and a change in the fiscal framework. Now, our thinking here is that maybe it's slightly excessive. And it could also be partly attributable to some worries about central banks beginning to react to this rising inflation. Now, our thinking here is that, first of all, consensus on monetary policy is still focusing on looking through this shock, which will likely be transitory if you assume some sort of a de-escalation eventually. And of course, the conflict itself is very difficult to predict. So it makes the job of policy tightening even more difficult for some of the central banks. So maybe with the exception of European Central Bank that could consider some rate adjustment in the middle of the year, the other central banks, especially the Fed, will likely remain very patient. And that's our assumption for the Fed in particular. We think they're not going to overreact to this. And what that means is that for the broader market, the pricing for an immediate hawkish turn is probably too excessive. And if that's the case, then the risky assets will still continue to receive a bit of support.
And what about the safe assets like gold, especially if you're saying that the Fed might not overreact? Are you also perhaps counting on more downside for the U.S. dollar?
So that's precisely our position. Our stance is still bearish on U.S. dollar and positive on gold. Our thinking here is that the Fed will keep the policy on pause for the foreseeable future, despite the volatility that we'll see on the inflation front. There'll be a combination of this bias to look through the supply side shock that will likely prove temporary, but also potentially a degree of political pressure from the White House, with Kevin Walsh now chairing the FOMC and the board discussion at the Fed. So if that's the case, then we're still looking at potential decline in the real interest rate in the U.S., and that's not a bad picture for non-dollar currencies and gold. And for that reason, we still maintain a relatively positive stance on gold, and we maintain overweight in our portfolios for the yellow metal. And for the non-dollar currencies, especially with China anchoring the broader FX market sentiment, and countries like Japan and South Korea trying to keep the downside risk for their currencies, we think the likely outcome for a dollar is to the downside.
Ho-Min Lee, always great to get your thoughts. Senior macro strategist at Lombard Odier. As we follow, of course, Asian markets, we are seeing a little bit of downside pressure for SoftBank as well, despite the fact that we had ADRs jumping in the overnight session. They reported a surge in quarterly profit due to valuation gains on their OpenAI investments. The gains actually outweighed lackluster investment gains elsewhere, so perhaps a little bit of more risk sentiment being felt in the SoftBank trade early in the Asia session, as we're seeing broadly the Nikkei and the topics seeing a little bit of divergence in the Japanese markets. This is Bloomberg.
This week, leaders from the world's two largest economies will come together in Beijing, with geopolitical stability and the future of global trade on the line. Trust Bloomberg to go beyond the headlines with on-the-ground reporting, expert analysis, and real-time market reaction. The Trump-Xi Summit. Special coverage all week right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
We're leading China in AI, and I'm going to go see President Xi in 2 weeks. I look forward to that, but I'll say I'm leading. We have very friendly competition, but it'll be a very important trip. We're doing a lot of business with China and making a lot of money. We're making a lot of money. It's different than it used to be. But I'll be talking about that'll be one subject. But he's been very nice about this. In all fairness, he gets like 60% of his oil from Hormuz, and I think he's been very respectful. We haven't been challenged by China. They don't challenge us. We're going to have a meeting with President Xi. It's going to be, I think, quite amazing. He's been a friend of mine. I've gotten along with him very well over the years.
You're watching the Asia Trade. We're coming to you live from Beijing, where we're looking ahead to that crucial Trump-Xi meeting in just a few hours' time. And President Trump is due to meet with President Xi Jinping today as part of this 36-hour trip, of course, a first for a U.S. president in almost a decade. Let's get to the Forbidden City now, where our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel is. And Steve, of course, nearby, in the Great Hall of the People, is where this meeting will take place. What are the expectations?
There are a lot of expectations, and they range in possible outcomes, no doubt. Clearly, on the geopolitical front, Iran is going to be at the backdrop of a lot of these talks, even though Donald Trump tried to downplay that as he boarded Air Force One to come to China. He landed last night, by the way. Again, it's potentially a liability on the domestic front with the war now into its third month. And, of course, the inflationary impact of that. And essentially, it has not necessarily met the timeline for the American audience. And also, keep in mind, China, this poses a risk to their recovery, no doubt. Yes, they've diversified to renewables. They have those buffers of 1.5 billion barrels of oil in strategic reserves. But again, it's a tax essentially on the global economy, which the Chinese economy's model is built upon. So, he doesn't necessarily want to emphasize that the Iran war is at the backdrop. It is, nevertheless. He's going to, though, he says, or he wants to, have a long talk with Xi Jinping about how the war in Iran is progressing and whether China, perhaps, and we're only speculating here, whether he's going to push Xi Jinping to have Beijing take a more active role in cajoling, if you will, or wielding their influence on Iran going forward. So we'll have to see how that plays out over the next very truncated state visit of about 36 hours, with the two gentlemen having several opportunities to meet over the next day and a half, including, of course, that state reception at the Great Hall of the People just down the moat here in the sidelines of Tiananmen Square, followed by a walk and talk, if you will, through the gardens and the grounds of the Temple of Heaven this afternoon. There's going to be a state dinner as well tonight, followed by opportunities of photo opportunities and a sitting down for tea in the Zhongnanhai Leadership Compound, not too far away from here, before he jets back to Washington, D.C. early afternoon tomorrow. So, again, I mentioned Iran, but perhaps the business ties and the possible deliverables on the commercial side might be the biggest news headlines coming out of this summit.
What about any headlines around Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan's a very sticky, very contentious issue, no doubt, and it's paramount for the Chinese leadership to get kind of a clarification on if the United States' position on Taiwan and its support of Taiwan, in particular with that arms package that is pending in Washington, D.C., whether anything has changed. This is of paramount importance to Xi Jinping. Clearly, the United States has telegraphed that there is no change to America's policy towards Taiwan. But with that big arms package about to be potentially approved by the president when he goes back to Washington, D.C., that is something that Xi Jinping is not necessarily going to like. So he will probably bring that up with Donald Trump. Now, back to that commercial relationship. We do have Jen-Hsun Huang here. We have Elon Musk. We have Tim Cook. We have a big contingent of American businesses, which really tells us that the stakes are quite high. I also met with another American businessman, Manny Menendez. He's been doing business here for 47 years. He first started a joint venture in 1979. He was the first man to help facilitate the largest joint venture, the first joint venture between American and Chinese entities of large corporations in the early 1980s. He knows and has seen the ups and downs of this relationship. He says two things are most important coming out of this summit. That is continual dialogue at the highest level, not just for this summit, but beyond, and also giving guidelines to businesses on what sectors to invest in cross the line of national security. Here's what he had to say.
With all that's going on in the world today, stability by the number one and number two economy of the world is I can't think of something more paramount. figuring out how to agree to disagree with respect and finding common ground, I think needs to be worked on continuously, not in just 36 hours, but continuously. I'm really interested in is really having a better definition of national security. What constitutes, especially I'm talking from a business standpoint, where's that line drawn on national security when it comes to products and services? Because once the line is drawn, then the business community can then, I really believe, increase business between both countries.
That's why I think it's important we find or see if there's headlines crossing on this proposal. It's a story that's been reported by Reuters, essentially that the two sides are discussing a framework for about $30 billion from each country to essentially be identified as areas that can be invest tariff-free, that are not necessarily crossing over into that national security area that causes a lot of this friction over this last year.
Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there outside the Forbidden City in Beijing. And of course, one of those sectors where we could see some business and something that Steve has already mentioned is around chips as well, given, of course, Jen-Hsun joining the delegation visiting Beijing at the last minute. So could China get some more chip access? Nvidia has already secured the license to sell some less advanced processors to customers there. So we have seen really that rally continue around hardware names on the Chinex, and the Chinex now outperforming the Hang Seng Tech Index, which is populated by internet names at a time when we saw that pressure for Alibaba and Tencent struggling to generate new revenue from artificial intelligence. Asia Equities reporter Winnie Su joins us for more on what's happening around these markets. Winnie, we are seeing the summit optimism really translate into market gains.
Yeah, exactly, Shery. As you see yesterday, how Minimax and Zhipu actually showed double-digit gains when we heard the news on how Jen-Hsun is joining the Trump-Xi meeting. And as you mentioned, that is a lot about how investors are now expecting that there can be a deal when it comes to the U.S. chip exports and potentially for more advanced chips, because these have exactly been some of the bottlenecks that these Chinese AI companies are facing. However, when it comes to how much of a magnitude, this can be a catalyst, but just because Beijing is really still pushing for that self-sufficiency, a bigger breakthrough or a bigger catalyst would most likely come from there.
And yet we're seeing the difficulty when it comes to monetizing artificial intelligence, right? We saw that in the results of Tencent as well as Alibaba.
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to the AI spending, it is a lot of spending that they are paying on AI. And that's why we saw that these two companies actually missed analyst estimates when it comes to their quarterly results. However, interestingly, you were seeing how the ADRs shifted from negative to a jump later on in the session overnight in the U.S. And that is because analysts actually are seeing a bit of signs when it comes to that AI monetization starting to bear fruits for these companies. For example, you are looking at Alibaba's cloud growing at about 38% when it comes to revenue, while Tencent Cloud also growing at about 20%. And looking forward, management from Alibaba actually mentioned how they are expecting that annual annual recurring revenue from AI to jump to 30 billion RMB by the end of this year, which is also higher than previously expected.
Bloomberg Asia Equities reporter Winnie Su there joining us from Hong Kong. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at how some of these names in Korea are moving, especially in the tech sector. Of course, we do have chips rebounding with the semiconductor index gaining ground overnight. Chip back in focus as we had Nvidia's Jen-Hsun now in China. Of course, take a look at SK Hynix, a little bit of downside pressure, so your board looks a little bit mixed. But SK Hynix just closed at around that $950 billion valuation just yesterday, so very close to that $1 trillion club, which Samsung Electronics has just entered very recently. And of course, that robot trade, Hyundai Motor carrying that up 2%. Earlier in the week, we had heard that potentially the South Korean military wanted to use some of the robots in the front lines from Hyundai Motors as well. We have more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Don't look at this visit or China-US relations from who wins, who lose. It's a long-term relationship.
But also trade, in addition to the trade, the investment. China is interested to invest in the U.S. A lot of companies interested to invest. And then if we say those non-sensitive, those really what needed in the U.S., helping the manufacturing, helping the employment in the U.S., why not? So I think President Trump is very pragmatic. He welcomed Chinese investment.
You are watching the Asia Trade. We're live from Beijing, where we're looking ahead to today's meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, and of course President Trump's entourage this time, including some of the most prominent US business leaders, really reflecting the importance that he attaches to commerce with China. Let's bring back our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel, who joins us from just outside the Forbidden City. And Steve, there's been sort of, jokes as to whether this is a trade mission versus a diplomatic mission, right? And we've been talking about kind of corporate Team America being represented on this visit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the who's who on that airplane, as well as flying separately in here for the first day of the summit today. Just in about an hour and a half time from now is when Donald Trump will be arriving at the Great Hall of the People. There'll be a number of discussions. Yes, there's going to be talk about the geopolitical stresses, but the emphasis is also going to be on the commercial ties. Keep in mind, going back for decades, the strength of this China-U.S. relationship has been based on commercial ties. And it's been more recently, of course, in the last couple of decades, last decade and a half, if you will, where the lines have been blurred between commercial interests and geopolitical competition, if you will. Now it's also, of course, as China has risen quite substantially, it's the commercial competition as well, which is a healthy part of a relationship, no doubt. And a lot of the CEOs and company leaders that are on this delegation have extensive ties and experience doing business in China. We're not just talking about Jen-Hsun or Kelly Ortberg of Boeing, or of course Tim Cook has a lot of manufacturing through his OEM partners here in China, but Elon Musk has a gigafactory in Shanghai. He also wants approval for full self-driving in this country and robo-taxi service and the like. So they have quite a bit of individual interests as well. But then you have Jane Fraser, you have Steve Schwarzman. Schwarzman has the Schwarzman Scholars and the college at Tsinghua University. So there's extensive China knowledge in this business delegation coming here. So what's going to come of it? Well, the markets have been reading into it, as you all know, how Jen-Hsun being added to the Air Force One manifest, if you will, at the last minute in Alaska and coming here on board indicates that there might be some sort of indication from the two leaders that the most advanced accelerators from Nvidia will be purchased by China, because keep in mind, there was first the H-20, which got approval from the White House. China balked. They're building out their own indigenous innovation, their own chips, and their own AI, separate from what's happening in the United States. Also, the H-200, more advanced chipset, that could potentially be indicated by Xi Jinping that they're willing to buy. So this is a pivotal moment for the whole AI supply chain, the AI infrastructure build out, AI in general. So we are watching that extremely closely. One thing we've been thinking about for quite some time is whether that sort of long discussed deal for a Boeing aircraft, which, there hasn't, I don't remember the exact date the last time China bought planes from Boeing, but it's been close to a decade. So this would be big for Boeing, no doubt, where Airbus has made significant grounds in this country compared to Boeing. So we're watching that quite closely. And again, where that line blurs oftentimes between geopolitics and commercial interests are the agricultural purchases. So Trump is coming here looking to sell or get commitments for the Chinese to buy more soybeans, get beef back on the table of Chinese households. Corn is also going to be discussed. So there's so much to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, the 3 Bs, as we've been talking about, Steve, is so important, especially for President Trump when it comes to appealing to his base at home, right? But also, we have to keep in mind the leverage that Beijing has, especially when we're talking about tech and rare earth metals as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with an earlier guest we had on, China found this leverage in rare earths, and they're not going to let go of that at all. I mean, they would be foolish to let go of that, no doubt. The United States has its levers as far as export controls. It seems as though if there can be some progress made on the tech front with the AI chips on the export controls and easing of that, or at least a clearer definition of what would be necessary for the licensing process, approval process, that would help maybe, bring down some of the strengths that China has employed over the last year, and that is their own export controls and licensing process on the most key rare earths. The golden screws, they are known. And believe me, China tightened those screws last year when it was under assault by upwards of 145% tariffs by the Trump administration. They got into a tit-for-tat retaliatory battle, which the fact that we are here at this point right now talking flattery between the two leaders is quite a lot of progress.
Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Angle there for us in Beijing, just outside the Forbidden City, of course, very close to where this key meeting will be taking place in the coming hours. And let's get some analysis now with Joe Mazur, who's a senior analyst at Trivium China. Really great to have you with us, and of course, exciting times here in Beijing. We were talking to one of our previous guests who was alluding to this idea of right-size expectations from both sides, right? In the light of sort of managing the expectations, what do you think the deliverables will be? Because obviously President Trump sees himself as a deal maker.
Right, and I think that's the thing. I think that makes it very difficult to pin down exactly what to expect from this meeting. So on the one hand, it could be quite conservative, deliverables might be quite limited. On the other hand, because of Trump's deal-making sensibilities, there's perhaps scope for something a little bit more robust, more surprising. So I think it is hard to pin down exactly what to expect. I think that certainly we'll see some deliverables on trade, that being sort of the core issue at stake in this meeting. But apart from that, I think it's really anybody's guess.
We've already seen some of the expectations being set for, the 3 Bs, as you say, the soybeans, planes and beef. But what about the sort of non-low-hanging fruit, right? What do you think we could get when it comes to AI or chips, for example? Because that last-minute inclusion of Jen-Hsun has got everyone a bit more interested in that. Yeah,
that was certainly a bit surprising, and I think it does indicate that some discussion of tech is certainly going to be on the table. To what extent that's going to result in anything meaningful, I think, is kind of an open question, right? I mean, the U.S. tends to view these chip restrictions as a major form of leverage it has over China, but China also views it that way, which means that any sort of deal they make with the U.S. is going to be predicated on not blunting China's own push for domestic technological self-sufficiency and really taken very cautiously.
President Trump's strategic trademark, if you will, one of them has been to really blur the lines between what we do on tech and what we do on geopolitics. So do you see a situation where if they're asking for help on Iran, Beijing could well be, in addition to saying we want concessions on Taiwan, but we always also want concessions when it comes to access to chips?
Yeah, I don't think it's impossible that there will be some kind of quid pro quo for action on Iran. Having said that, China is quite risk-averse when it comes to diplomacy that's far from its own borders. The Iran crisis obviously does impact on China's core interest in terms of energy supply chains, Middle East stability, etc. But equally, I don't think that we're going to see any kind of flotilla, for example, of Chinese warships going to the Strait of Hormuz to unblock it. I think that anything that China commits to will either A, be more of what it's already been doing, which is sort of this kind of cautious back back channeling or B, something that is done as a quid pro quo for something else.
So you think that progress could be made when it comes to Iran?
I don't think it's impossible, but I think that the U.S. would have to come up with a pretty hefty quid pro quo for that to happen.
Is Taiwan the bargaining chip there?
It could be, and I think that China has a better shot of extracting concessions from Trump than they would have from previous administrations, right? Trump is kind of famously ambivalent about U.S. security commitments, and whereas previous administrations would never have countenanced it, I think it's not impossible that the Chinese side could press Trump for a reduction of either material or rhetorical support for Taiwan. Now, of course, Trump's going to have his whole cabinet yelling at him not to do that, not to reduce support for Taiwan in any way. But ultimately, Trump is going to keep his own counsel, and I think it's not completely out of the question that some kind of deal could be reached.
One sort of way that we've been contextualizing this is looking at who comes in with more leverage, right? Who has a bit more game coming into this meeting. Obviously, Trump has two conflicts that he's been dealing with. He's coming into midterms. Yeah. The economy is clearly showing signs of strain. Do you think Beijing at the moment perhaps has the upper hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of direct negotiations with the U.S., in terms of the export controls on rare earths and sort of the ability that China demonstrated last year to sort of back down the U.S. In that trade war, I think certainly there is a playbook that works there, and the U.S. doesn't really have anything comparable. Equally, though, China is interested in preserving trade stability. It doesn't want a repeat of the ups and downs of 2025, and so I think it's also incentivized to, play its cards in a sensible manner and not to overextend itself when it comes to these negotiations.
What's also been interesting is that China, obviously, through official voices, has been calling for an end to U.S. hegemony, as it refers to, for so long now. Yeah. The president has, until, I guess, the most recent conflict in Iran, been fairly isolationist, almost playing into that narrative as well. Do you think this presidency sort of fundamentally changes U.S.-China ties?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in terms of the U.S. relationship with the rest of the world, I mean, I think many U.S. allies and partners could have written off Trump 1 as a fluke, but now that he's back and he's, if anything, sort of more intent on tearing up a lot of the aspects of the post-war order, I think that China does have an opening then to say, well, we're comparatively speaking the adult in the room. Whether China can capitalize that, to the full extent that they would like to, I think is maybe an open question. I think certainly there may be, bewilderment about the U.S., but also there's a fair amount of mistrust of China globally. So I think there's certainly an opening for China, but it'll need to think about how best to seize on that.
These surveys about that mistrust actually dwindling in places like even America and Australia is actually quite fascinating. But Joe, really great to have you with us. We appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
And your time with us today. Joe Mazur, who's a senior analyst at Trivium China, and of course our coverage, these conversations on the Trump-Xi summit continues all day. We'll be live here from Beijing with conversations with leading analysts and experts tackling those key issues on the table: Taiwan, the Iran war, trade and tech tensions between the two biggest economies. Shery.
And of course, Haidi, there are other global headlines that we're also following here on Bloomberg. Gunshots have been fired at the Philippine Senate, where a lawmaker wanted by the International Criminal Court has taken refuge. Senator Ronald De La Rosa is wanted by the ICC for his role in alleged crimes related to former President Rodrigo Duterte's violent war on drugs. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has called for calm and denied any government involvement in Wednesday night's incident.
I want to inform all our fellow citizens about this incident. Let us remain calm. I've already spoken with Senate President Alan Cayetano, and we agreed that the thing to do now is to tell our people all to calm down, and we will get to the bottom of this.
Bloomberg's been told that UK Health Secretary Wes Streeting is planning to challenge Prime Minister Keir Starmer as Labour Party leader. Streeting's backers say he's likely to quit his cabinet post this week to launch his leadership bid, while Starmer supporters say he'll fight any attempt to replace him. A leadership contest could drag on for months at a time when the UK faces weak growth, self-employment, and rising inflation. More ahead, this is Bloomberg.
Well, of all the countries of the world, economies are melting down. because of this crisis in the Straits, they're going to be buying less Chinese product, and the Chinese exports are going to drop precipitously. So it's in their interest to resolve this. We hope to convince them to play a more active role in getting Iran to walk away from what they're doing now and trying to do now in the Persian Gulf.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on China's potential role in the Iran conflict. Of course, we know that China is the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, and U.S. authorities have sanctioned some Chinese firms on that flow. But take a look at how commodities are trading, because we're seeing a little bit more upside when it comes to oil prices and reversing those losses earlier in the day. Of course, we still have a structurally tight physical market given the ongoing war in Iran, now in its 3-month. Copper prices saw a little bit of downside, but still above that 14,000 level. And remember, that was already a record high, given physical supplies are tight when it comes to the metal space as well, Heidi, as we continue to watch, of course, all of the metal moves, especially given how big a role China plays in this space.
Yeah, critical mineral, Shery, another key issue when it comes to President Trump's agenda here in China as he kicks off the 36-hour visit. A fresh analysis from Bloomberg Economics finding that around 4% of US GDP, that's around $1.2 trillion, is derived from industries that use rare earths. That gives Beijing, with its dominance of rare earth supply chains, near total control of an important slice of the US economy. For more, Bloomberg Insight anchor Haslinda Amin is also here in Beijing with me, and this is really such a strong geopolitical lever that Beijing has to flex.
Well, that's right. And we saw how China has weaponized rare earths. We saw that back in April last year. I mean, when the U.S. imposed higher tariffs on Chinese exports, China went, you know what, we're holding, rare earth supplies to you. And that brought the U.S. to its knees. And it forced Trump to rethink his tariffs, and we saw the détente back in October when both leaders met in Busan, and here we are with the détente, and they're continuing with their conversations. The thing is, there's really no alternative to Chinese rare earths, right? We know that China controls the supply chain, controls 90% of production, 90% of batteries, and if you take a look around the world, there's really no viable alternatives. And as you said, the U.S. economy is dependent on Chinese rare earths, 4% of its GDP, $1 trillion of its GDP on the back of that. So now the U.S. wants to break the dominance. The question really is how quickly it can do that. It wants to invest in alternatives. It's given money, to projects in Brazil, in Japan, in Australia even. But the question really is how soon that can happen. We know that the target really is to produce about 100,000 tons of battery every single year by 2030. That is ambitious, and that is difficult to do. And people say realistically, it will take longer than that. So, until that happens, it does seem like the U.S. will be at the mercy of China's rare earths.
Our analysis is showing that, the progress is real, but it is just slow, and there's no shortcuts to be able to get there, regardless of significant investment in sort of alternatives.
Well, that's right. And we know that there's a concerted effort. We know that as of last year, basically Trump has said, to the EDU, which is the Economic Defense Unit within the Pentagon, to say, go look for the deals. And they're looking. The trouble really is there is a lack of clarity and credibility in some of these projects, pretty much untested. So you don't even know if, the billions of dollars going into these projects will bear fruit. That is one of the criticism. But the upside really that some say, the Pentagon is finally doing something about it. I mean, for a very long time, they sat there in the seats without really doing anything about it. Whether or not it's going to bear fruit, that is one thing, but at least it's trying to do something about it.
Bloomberg Insight anchor Haslinda Amin here in Beijing with perhaps one of the thornier issues, or one of the more difficult issues that we'll see on the agenda when the two leaders meet. And subscribers can turn to the terminal for more on this. TLI Vigo is your function when it comes to our live blog. Latest updates, commentary, analysis from our team of expert editors. Shery.
And Haidi, we do have breaking news at the moment from the mayor of Kyiv in Ukraine. He's now saying that the city is under massive attack. He's also saying that the defense system is currently working. This also coming after overnight news from President Zelensky that they saw massive attacks, a barrage of Russian attacks on regions close to the border with NATO members. Of course, this war between Ukraine and Russia now ongoing for more than 2 years. We have more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
This week, leaders from the world's 2 largest economies will come together in Beijing. With geopolitical stability and the future of global trade on the line. Trust Bloomberg to go beyond the headlines with on-the-ground reporting, expert analysis, and real-time market reaction. The Trump-Xi Summit. Special coverage all week right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
And the top corporate stories that we're tracking: Cisco shares jumped in late trade after fourth quarter guidance topped estimates by nearly $1 billion. It also announced plans to cut almost 4,000 jobs as part of a restructuring to focus on AI. Cisco is ramping up investment in silicon chips, fiber optics, and security, and expects to get $9 billion in orders from hyperscalers in fiscal 2026. Cerebra System has raised more than $5.5 billion in its U.S. IPO in the year's biggest offering so far. The AI chip maker priced its shares at $185 each, giving it a market value of about $40 billion. Sources say the IPO was more than 20 times oversubscribed. Shares are expected to trade on Thursday in the U.S. on the Nasdaq Global Select Market. Ford shares surged to a 6-year high after Morgan Stanley issued a bullish call, citing potential deals between its energy storage business and hyperscalers. The bank estimates Ford Energy could be worth $10 billion and sees opportunity for its valuation to approach that of Tesla's energy business. Ford signed a licensing deal in 2023 with Chinese battery giant CATL.
And Shery, of course, we continue to count down to what is going to be this key meeting between President Trump and Xi in Beijing. They'll be meeting at the Great Hall of the People a little later on this morning. Following that welcoming ceremony, there'll also be that state banquet as well as a tour, a walk through the Temple of Heaven. This is a 36-hour visit and really key given that we've not seen a U.S. presidential visit in 9 years, almost a decade, in fact. A lot on the table from geopolitics. We know that President Trump wants Beijing's input and help potentially when it comes to ending the war in the Middle East and its role in being able to influence Tehran potentially. The issue of Taiwan no doubtly will come up as well, but also a big focus on trade and commerce with the big delegation from Team Corporate America, including really everyone from Tim Cook of Apple, Kelly Ortberg of Boeing. We're also looking at that last-minute inclusion of Jen-Hsun from Nvidia as well, potentially putting AI and chip access back on the table. But Shery, you broke the news a little bit earlier, just in the last few minutes, from Kyiv under massive missile attack. Air defense is working according to the city's mayor. And of course, it is interesting that this is just another example of a conflict that the US has also been involved in, that it has also seen that sort of exercise of power diplomacy in terms of what Beijing can do to influence its other friend, Russia.
What a difference 6 months makes, right? I mean, this Ukraine-Russia war has been ongoing for more than 2 years now. But on top of that, President Trump has to deal with the war that he started in Iran. And as you said, he will be looking for whatever help he can get from President Xi Jinping when it comes to trying to end that conflict in the Middle East. But we continue to hear from analysts that Beijing will probably be more reluctant to get involved as a direct mediator here. So we'll continue to watch the latest developments as we head towards that much anticipated summit. This is Bloomberg.